In the previous videos, we saw how different parts of the brain do different things. In this video, we will describe how these different parts send messages to one another, combining their actions to produce the living, breathing human being that is ourselves. Through a combination of chemicals and electricity, the various parts of the brain communicate with each other and with the rest of the body. It might be a good idea though to start by looking at the cells that make up the brain. The surface of the brain is composed of gray matter. Sometimes researchers just call it the gray, but underneath it is a mass of white matter. This white matter consists of nerve fibers passing messages around from one area of the brain to another area, which is how everything is interconnected. The nerve fibers are white because they are myelinated. Most of the cells that make up the gray matter, on the other hand, are interneurons, sometimes called connector neurons. Their main purpose is to make connections between nerve cells. So their structure is relatively simple. An interneuron consists of a cell body with many projections extending outwards to form branches or dendrites. Sometimes there is a long projection from the cell body known as an axon. And the dendrites are found at the end of that. Each dendrite end is a small lump called synaptic knob or synaptic button, which makes a connection with other neurons. There are other types of neurons in the nervous system. Sensory neurons pick up signal at the sense receptors, the eyes, the skin, the nose, and the ears, and pass them to the brain. These neurons have specialized receptor areas at one end, which pass the signal along the cell body. From there, the message travels along an axon to the relevant part of the brain. Other neurons, called motor neurons, take messages from the brain down to the muscles, allowing us to move. Now, besides neurons, there are a number of other cells in the brain, which go by the general name glia cells. Now, their main function is to support the neurons by holding them in place and providing them with oxygen and nutrients. They also remove dead nerve tissues and toxic substances. They help to insulate the neurons from one another, and they can be important in stimulating cell growth. So the brain is a closely packed, dense mass of cells, but as we saw in the previous video, it still has recognizable structures. It also has some quite large spaces, fluid-filled areas known as ventricles. Now, these are inside the brain but linked to the spinal canal, a relic of the early neural tube. The ventricles are filled with cerebrospinal fluids, which is a clear liquid that provides nutrients and immune support to the brain structures and clears away waste products. The ventricles can also act as a shock absorber, like an airbag, protecting some of the most vital brain structures against impact. So, brain cells work essentially by using chemicals to generate electricities like all living cells. They have slightly different electrical field than their surroundings. Inside the cell, there's a slightly higher concentration of potassium ions, which have a negative electrical charge. Usually, the membrane surrounding the cell stops other chemical ions from passing through. But if it is stimulated in the right way, it changes its structure, letting sodium ions through. These have a positive electrical charge, and the exchange of positive and negative ions generate a sudden burst of electricity in the cell. We call this sudden burst of electricity as an electrical impulse. Electrical impulses travel around the brain by moving along the extended arm, which are axons of the neurons. Sometimes they travel relatively slow as each impulse changes the next part of the cell membrane, depolarizing it so that the sodium ions can get into uh, into renew the electrical impulses. But that's a relatively slow and gradual way of getting the message along. Neurons that need to send messages quickly have a different structure. Their axons are covered with white matter, which helps the message to move more quickly. Now, the white matter, but as you can see in this image, it's pink. It should be white. The white matter in these cells is fatty coating known as a myelin sheath. It's made up of special cells called Schwann cells, wrapping themselves around the axons with very small gaps where the cell membrane is exposed to its surroundings. Each Schwann cell insulates the axons, preventing the exchange of positive and negative ions. This means that the electrical impulse can only be renewed at the gaps between the Schwann cells, and the impulse has to travel along the axon in large jumps. That's much faster, and that's what white matters of the brain is all about. It consists of billions of myelinated nerve fibers buzzing with electrical messages flying from one part of the brain to another. Now, that's how electrical messages pass along the neurons. But the question is, how do these pass from one neuron to the other? This takes us back to the synaptic knob mentioned earlier. This is the connection between the connection between two neurons is known as the synapse, a gap between two neurons. Each synaptic knob faces a receptor site across the gap at the next neuron. Synaptic knobs or synaptic buttons contain small pockets or what is called vesicles, which are filled with a special chemical called neurotransmitters or neurotransmitter. Now, when the electrical impulse reaches the synaptic knob, the vesicle open and spills their neurotransmitter into the gap. It is then picked up by at a receptor site on the dendrite of the next neuron, changing the electrical polarity of the neural membrane. Any one neuron will always contain the same neurotransmitter in its vesicle, but there are many different transmitter chemicals used in the nervous system. The influence of the chemicals from one single synapse wouldn't be enough to make another neuron react. But if enough synapses are stimulated, the cell membrane of the next neuron changes. Some synapses make the next cell move cell more likely to fire, and these are known as excitatory synapses because they excite and stimulate the neuron. Other synapses make the neurons that is receiving the message less likely to fire, and they are known as inhibitory synapses because they inhibit firing. The combination of excitatory and inhibitory synapses create pathways through the brain directing impulses towards some brain areas and away from others. So, throughout the cerebral cortex, indeed throughout the brain, there are neural pathways channeling electrical impulses from one area to another. These pathways are partly inherited, but they are also strongly shaped by our experiences. When a baby is born, its brain has far more connections between neurons than at any other time. Just about every possible synapse is live. But over the first 3 years of life, these connections are pruned down, meaning connections that are used become stronger while unused connections die away. That that still leaves us a billion of synaptic connections. Of course, it's only a gradual pruning, not a severe one. So the question is, why does this happen? It all has to do with how adaptable we are as a species. Human beings, or at least human societies, are found in all sorts of different environments. From the frozen Arctic to the baking deserts to jungles, and even in mid-continent environments where temperatures can vary from 40 degrees Celsius to negative 40 degrees Celsius during the course of a year. We can survive in all these environments, even though the survival skills we need for them are very different. But we don't survive by adapting physically. We do it by learning. From the moment it is born, or from even before birth, a human infant is learning about its world. After birth, its main orientation is to learn from the other people around it. And that learning can take many forms. By the age of 3, a human child has pretty well learned to cope with its physical world at least. Coping with the social world is more complicated though. So humans have an incredible capacity for learning, and that's what the human brain is all about. Learning happens as the nerve cells in the brain strengthens particular synapses, weakens others, and channel nerve impulses through unfamiliar pathways to produce a given effect. Our brain cells respond to the demands of new learning in two ways. One way is by building up the synapses, or at least growing the capacity of the synaptic knob and its associated receptor site, so that more neurotransmitter is released and picked up, making a stronger message. The other way is through myelination. A neuron that fires only occasionally doesn't generally develop a myelin sheath, but Schwann cells are attached to active neurons. So if a group of cells continue to be stimulated, as they will when we are learning something new, Schwann cells begin to wrap themselves around their axons. As we've seen, myelination helps the message to pass along the neurons more quickly, so we find it easier to do the things we are learning. A lot of our learning happens when we are infant, but we continue to learn throughout our lives. This means that we are constantly placing demands on our brain cells, encouraging them to form new connections. For example, we are not born with the ability to read. Neither did we evolve the capacity. In most human cultures, reading, if it ever existed at all, was a limited skill, restricted to only a few individuals. Yet, we are all capable to learn how to do it. It takes sustained effort and a lot of experience with the written word, yet most people can read fluently by the time they are 10 or 12 years old. Some people may take longer depending on their experiences and their motivation to put in the effort required. Now, the cerebral cortex consists of many groups of neurons known as nuclei. As we learn to read, certain nuclei in the brain are stimulated and begin to develop new connections. In many, it may be that some of these nuclei evolved evolved originally to be sensitive to natural signs or symbols to warn us that red might be dangerous, for example, since it's the color of blood. But however they evolved, given the right kind of experience, this nuclei will adapt to deal with other kinds of symbols as well. If that experience is repeated exposure to the written word, and most importantly to its meaning, the nuclei generally adapts or gradually adapts to allow us to read fluently. Now, the more experience we have of reading, the more the group of neurons develop until ultimately we end up with an area of the brain specifically adapted for decoding written words. Now, the same thing is happening all over our brains as we learn to deal with other demands made by our environment and experiences. It's not random. Certain areas develop in certain ways because those nuclei are predisposed to deal with that kind of information. Much of that has been shaped by our evolutionary history. So we find similar areas in the brains of other mammals. But how far we take it and how sophisticated our skills become have everything to do with our human ability to learn. Our evolution has demanded that we learn new skills to cope with the ever-changing environment. So we have evolved the brain structures that allow us to do this. Now, the ability of brain cells to adapt is known as neural plasticity or neuroplasticity, and it continues throughout our lives, contrary to the popular belief that you cannot teach old dogs new tricks. And it continues, it is used to be thought that the brain would adapt only up to the age of puberty, and that after that, the function of our brain was largely fixed. Now, we know that this isn't the case. Yes, children do recover from brain damage more easily than adults, sometimes even by regrowing areas of the brain, but adults are also able to recover from many types of damages to the brain by rechanneling neural impulses so that they form new pathways. We know too that neurons can continue to grow and develop throughout our lives as long as they receive the cognitive or physical demands needed to stimulate that growth. Now, the human brain retains its ability to adapt to new physical circumstances too. A study of astronauts showed how exposure to microgravity can produce changes in the brain. Koppelman and company in 2016 used MRI scans to compare the brains of shuttle crews and international space station astronauts before and after their time in space. They found that the astronaut's brain had developed more gray matter around areas particularly concerned with lower limb movements. The longer they had spent in space, the more this example of neural plasticity was evident. The lower limbs are particularly important on Earth in gravity-bound movements, but are much less important in the microgravity of space. So the researchers suggested that the neural changes came from the brain trying to adjust to this to these differences. Now, a similar, though not identical result came from comparison with people experiencing prolonged bed rest. Other studies have shown how the brain is able to reorganize itself after the damage produced by a stroke, the sudden interruption of the blood supply to an area of the brain. Now, the lack of oxygen causes crucial nerve cells to die. The normal functions such as movements or speech to become impaired. Now, we know from clinical experience that people are able to recover from this, often getting almost full functioning back. But they do have to put a lot of effort in put a lot of effort in if they are going to manage it. Now, the nerve cells in the brain respond to those efforts by reorganizing themselves, bypassing damaged areas and developing new pathways to achieve the action or ability being demanded of the body. Even people who have lost whole areas of the brain can sometimes regain function. Damage to language areas of the brain, which are mainly, though not always found in the left hemisphere, can seriously interfere with a person's ability to use language, to speak, or to form words, or even to understand them. But in 1980, Gooch reported on the result of a dramatic operation. A few clinical patients had such severe damage to the left hemisphere that surgeons decided to remove that half of the brain altogether. Before the operation, they had been entirely unable to use language. But when the damaged hemisphere was completely removed, they began to recover, to be able to speak, understand, and even to remember the words of old songs. The right side of their brain had taken over the language functions that had previously been located on the left. This level of plasticity was entirely unsuspected, and it showed how making simplistic models of the brain how works is generally a mistake. It's always more complicated than we first think. Now, Gooch's report challenged the idea that language is located only in the left hemisphere and showed how adaptable our brain hemispheres can be. As a general rule, though, there is a certain amount of lateralisation in the brain. One side of the brain does one thing while the other side does another. For example, the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. Instructions from the right side of the brain to move your hand, for example, will result in your left hand moving and vice versa. The exceptions to this are the senses located in your head. Your eyes and ears both have crossover points so that both sides of the brain receive information from each eye or ear. The ears need this because assessing the differences in the sound coming from each ear is an important cue that tells us where sounds are coming from. In the eyes, the crossover means that information coming from the left side of your eye, that is from things to the right of your vision, go to the left side of the brain, while information coming from the right side of your eye goes to the right side of the brain. So each eye can see the whole visual field, but the brain can also compare the two images. Researchers have been able to use this to explore how different sides of the brain works. Using a screen to hide one part of the visual field, they have shown how the left side of the brain is able to understand written instructions, while the right side doesn't usually read but can understand other types of meanings. There's a bit of crossover too. For example, if you showed the right side of the brain the word key, the person might not be able to say what the writing said, but they might be able to pick out a key from a tray of objects. So there would be some grasps of meaning on that side of the brain, but not confident reading. Most people have a preferred hand too. And sport people know that we all often have a preferred foot, although the two are not necessarily the same. Most people are right-handed but many are left-handed. Right-handed people usually have clearly dominant left hemisphere, but left-handers show more balance between the hemispheres, with a lot of activity on the left side as well as the right. They also show more variability in which hemisphere their main language is located. Right, left, or as some people show equal activity between the two. Now, right-handers are much more likely to be left hemisphere dominant for language, but nobody has ever shown a link between hemisphere dominance and cognitive ability. Whichever side of the brain you prefer to use, your abilities and skills have equal potential. Now, there are a number of common myths about the right and left hemisphere of the brain, as shown in this image. You may hear, for example, that the right brain is more creative while the left brain is more analytical, or that the right brain is mystical while the left brain is materialistic. These are large nonsense, being exaggerations from some much more precise scientific observations. Those scientific observations include the way that spatial problems like those involving diagram tend to be processed more in the right hemisphere, while arithmetic problems involving sums or counting are generally processed more by the left side of the brain. This observation, which in many cases is only a trend and doesn't apply to everyone, led to a common myth. The myth went something like this: spatial awareness equals drawing, equals art, equals artistic personality, equals creativity, while arithmetic equals numbers, equals counting, equals practical personality, equals materialism. But there's no evidence for those conclusions. In fact, we know that creativity, drawing as it does on skills, memories, abilities, and imaginations involve both hemispheres of the brain. Similarly, mathematicians use the right hemispheres as well as the left when processing mathematical problems. While there is some lateralisation of our brain functions, it's important to remember that the two halves of the brain generally complement one another. They are not opposites. They work together to give us our experiences. One side of the brain may analyze words for meanings, while the other analyzes the spoken nuances of tone, of voice, and timing. And together, they allow us to make sense of what people are saying to us. There have been some studies of people who have had the band of fibers known as corpus callosum cut through in an attempt to control severe epilepsy, which starts in one hemisphere but then spreads across the brain. When these people were tested, researchers found that the two halves of the brain could each operate independently, and that each had some of the ability normally reserved for the other. Language functions were on the left, for example, but the right hemisphere can also show the ability to read simple words. Similarly, the right hemisphere was far better at processing pictures, but the left also showed some of that ability. But what was particularly interesting were the accounts given by some of the people concerned. One woman, for example, described how her left hand might pick out a dress from her wardrobe even though she was not aware of making that choice, and had consciously been thinking about a quite different outfit. The brain has other surprises too. Brain scans have shown us how common mirror neurons are in the brain. The first mirror neurons to be discovered were in our movement system, and they showed that our brain activity doesn't just reflect our own actions. We show similar patterns of activity in the same parts of the brain when we are watching other people do things, as we show when we are doing them ourselves. It happens only if we are paying attention, of course. But if we were watching, say, a tightrope walker and imagining what it would be like, some of our own brain cells involved in balance and walking activity would also become active. Since the first discovery, researchers have found mirror systems in many parts of the brain, and particularly in those areas involved with social interaction, speech and conversation, social memory, and so on. When we are with or watching others, our brain activity is structured to emphasize with them to some extent or empathize with them to some extent. We are even more strongly social than we ever thought. As you watch our future videos, you'll come across other mirror neurons quite often. So the brain is made up of nerve cells called neurons, which make connections with one another and carry messages around the brain and to the rest of the body. Now, the brain's messages take the form of electrical impulses which jump from one neuron to another using special chemicals called neurotransmitters. Neural connections develop as well, or rather as we learn new things, and the brain is able to adapt to damage even in adulthood. This is known as neural plasticity, or as mentioned earlier, neuroplasticity. The left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and vice versa. Some other functions are also lateralized on one side of the brain or another, but not as many as as popular myth imply. In the first two lessons including this, we have seen the general picture of what the brain is like and roughly how it works. In the next video, we'll begin our specific explorations of how different parts of the brain achieve our experience of what it is to be a human being, starting with how we see the world. Again, my name is Dex Kamitan, and thank you for watching.